Chapter 3 of Highacres by Jane Abbott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 3. On the Road to Cobble. The next day, Mr. Toby Chubb's fly-by-day, as Dr. Travis called the one automobile that Miller's Notch boasted, chugged busily over the mountain roads. John Wesley started out very early to find his friends at Cobble. Then he had to drive back to Wayside to appease a distraught manager and half a dozen angry guides, and also to pack his belongings. For the Allens would not let him stay anywhere else but with them at Cobble. Then, after he had been comfortably established in the freshly painted and papered guest room of the old stone house which the Allens had been remodeling, he coaxed Mrs. Allen to drive back to SunnySide, that she might, before the day passed, get better acquainted with Jerry and Jerry's mother.
"I couldn't feel more excited if I'd found a gold mine there on the side of Kettle,"
John Wesley had told his friends. Mrs. Allen, an attractive young woman, was accustomed to many congenial friends about her, had been wondering deep in her heart if she was not going to find Cobble just the least little bit lonely at times, so she listened with deep interest to John Wesley's account of Jerry and SunnySide.
"I can't just describe why the girl seems so different. It's that she's so confoundedly natural. There's a freshness about her that's like one of those clean, cool mountain winds whipping through you."
Mrs. Allen laughed at his awkward attempt to explain Jerry. She was used to girls. She loved them. She understood just what he was trying to say. He went on,
"And here she is, growing up, tucked away on the side of that mountain, with a mother who's more like a sister, I guess. Says she skates and skis and does everything with her child. And the most curious father. Don't believe he's been further away from Kettle than Waytown more'n 3 or 4 times in his life. Sits there with his books, when he isn't jogging off on his horse to see some sick mountaineer, and the kindest, gentlest soul that ever breathed. There's an atmosphere in that house that is different, upon my word. Makes one think of the old stories of kings and queens who disguised themselves as peasants. Simple meal, everything sort of shabby, but you couldn't give all that a thought. There was such a feeling of peace and happiness everywhere."
John Wesley actually had to stop for breath, but he was too eager and too much in earnest to mind the glint of amusement in Mrs. Allen's eyes.
"When I went to bed, didn't that big amber-eyed cat of Jerry's follow me upstairs and into the room, and stretch herself across my bed just as though that was what I'd expect. I never in my life before slept with a cat in the room, but I felt as though it would be the height of rudeness to chuck her off the bed. And I haven't slept so soundly since I've been sick as I did in that little room. I think it was the piney smell about everything. Miss Jerry wakened me at an unearthly hour by throwing a rose through my window. It hit me square in the nose. The little rascal was standing down there in the sunshine, in her absurd trousers, with a basket of berries in her hand. She'd been off up the trail after them."
Although John Wesley's glowing account had prepared her for what she would find at SunnySide, 10 minutes after Penelope Allen had crossed the threshold, she could not resist nodding to him as much as to say,
"You are quite right."
In such places as SunnySide, little conventional restraints were unknown, and in a very few moments the two women were chatting like old friends, while Dr. Travis was explaining in his drawling voice the advantages of certain theories of planting, to which Will Allen listened intently, because he was planning a garden at Cobble, while John Wesley, only understanding a word now and then, wished he hadn't devoted so much of his time to cement, and knew more about spinach. Afterwards, as they drove down the rough trail back to Cobble, John Wesley demanded,
"Honestly, Pen Allen, Doesn't it strike you that there is a mystery about these Travis people?"
She hesitated a moment before answering, then laughed lightly as she spoke.
You funny man. The magic of these mountains is getting in your blood. Of course not. They are just a very happy family who know a little more than most of us about what's really worth while in this world. Now tell me about your own niece, Isobel, and that madcap Jip, and little Tib.
She knew well how fond John Wesley was of these three girls, and to talk of them brought to her a breath of what she had known at home before she had married Will Allen, the spring before.
"Oh, they're as bad as ever,"
he said in a tone that implied exactly the opposite.
"Isobel's growing more vain each day, and Jip more heedless. And Tibby's going to spoil her digestion if her mother doesn't make her eat less candy and more oatmeal. I haven't seen much of the youngster since I was sick."
And Graham, poor boy, stuck in among those girls. He must be in long trousers now.
"Graham can take care of himself,"
laughed the uncle.
"Wish I had the four of them here with me. I wanted to bring them along, but Dr. Hewitt said it'd be the surest way to the undertaker. They are a good sort, but sometimes I wonder—"
You are an extraordinary uncle, to take the responsibility of your nieces and nephew the way you do.
"I can't help it. I've lived with them since they were babies, and it's just as though they were my own, and their father's away so much that I think their mother sort of depends on me. Sometimes I get a little bothered, their having the very best schooling and all the things money can give young people, and yet there's a sort of shallowness possessing them that makes them, well, not value the opportunities they're having."
You talk like a veritable schoolmaster,
laughed Mrs. Allen teasingly.
"Have you forgotten that when Uncle Peter Westley left Highacres to the Lincoln School, it made me trustee of the school? That's almost as bad as being the principal. And this year I'm going to take an active interest in the school, too. The doctor says I must have a diversity of interests to offset the strain of making cement mixers. And I think to rub against 200 boys and girls will fill the bill, don't you? They've remodeled the building at Highacres this summer, and completed one addition. There are 20 acres of ground, too, for outdoor athletics."
What a wonderful gift,
mused Mrs. Allen, recalling the pile of stone and marble old Peter Wesley had built in the outskirts of his city, that could never have been of any possible use to himself, because he had been a crusty old bachelor who hated to have anyone near him. Gossip had said that he had built it just because he wanted his house to cost more than any other house in the city. Unworthy as his motive in building it might have been, he had forever ennobled the place when he had bequeathed it to the boys and girls of his city.
"There'll be a chance, with the school out there, of offsetting just what's threatening Isobel and Jip. A sort of grown-upness they're putting on, like a masquerade costume."
I love your very manlike way of describing things,
laughed Mrs. Allen, recalling certain experiences of her own when, for 6 months, she had undertaken the care of her own niece, Patricia Everett.
It's so vivid, a masquerade make-up, too big and too long, and then when you peep under a grown-up costume, there's a little girl still, really loving to frolic around in a delightful sport that belonged to youth, and youth only.
John Wesley rode on for a few moments in deep silence, his mind on the young people he loved. Then suddenly it veered to the little girl he had found on the Wishing Rock, her eyes staring longingly out into a dream world that lay beyond valley and mountain top.
"I've an idea! A corker!"
he exclaimed, just as the fly-by-day bounced into the grass-grown drive of Cobble House. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 5 of Highacres by Jane Abbott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 5. Jerry's Wish Comes True. Jerry would, of course, never know how very hard Mr. John had to work to make her wish come true. Ever afterwards, she preferred to think that it was just standing on the wishing rock and wishing and wishing. She had noticed, however, and had been a little curious, that every time Mr. John had come to SunnySide, he and her mother had talked and talked together in low tones, so that, even when she was near them, she could not hear one word of what they were saying, and that after these talks her mother had been very pale, and had again and again, for no particular reason, hugged her very close and kissed her with what Jerry called a sad kiss. Then one afternoon Mrs. Allen had come with John Wesley, and her mother, to her disgust, had sent her down to the Notch with a message for old Mrs. Teed that had not seemed a bit important. After her return, John Wesley had invited her to take him and Big Boy and Pepperpot to the Witch's Glade, because, he said, he had something to tell her. It was a glorious afternoon. August was painting with her vivid coloring the mountain slopes and valleys. Over everything was a soft glow. It was reflected on Jerry's eager face. John Wesley pointed down into the valley where Jerry's shining road ran off out of sight. They could see an automobile like a speck moving swiftly along it.
"Your road, down there, goes off the other side of the mountain, and on, and after a very long way takes me back home. I'm going on Thursday."
Jerry turned a disappointed face. Each day of John Wesley's 2 weeks near Miller's Notch had brought immeasurable pleasure and excitement into her life.
"Mrs. Allen is going to drive back with me. She lived in my town, you know. She hasn't been home for months, and I shall enjoy her company."
Jerry was staring at the distant road. After a while, the specks that were automobiles and that she liked to watch would become fewer and fewer. The days would grow colder, school would begin, the snow would come and choke the trails, and she and Sweetheart and Little Dad would be shut in at SunnySide for weeks and weeks. Her face clouded.
"And now, listen very carefully, Jerry, and hold on to my arm, so that you won't fall off from the mountain. You are going with us."
Jerry did hold on to his arm with a grip that hurt. She stared with round, wondering eyes. He laughed at her unbelief.
"Your wish is coming true. You're going to ride along that road yonder, in my automobile, which ought to get here tomorrow, straight around to the other side of the mountain, and on and on. Then you're going to stay all winter with my own nieces, and go to school with them."
Jerry's breath came in an excited gasp.
"Oh, it can't be true. Mother'd never let me."
"It is true. Mothers are always willing to do the things that are going to be best for their girls. Mrs. Allen and I have persuaded her."
But Jerry, with a whoop, was racing down the trail, Big Boy and Pepperpot at her heels. She vaulted the little gate leading into the garden and swept like a small whirlwind upon her mother, sitting in the willow rocker on the porch. With a violent hug, she tried to express the madness of her joy, and so completely was her face hidden on her mother's shoulder that she did not see the quick tears that blinded her mother's eyes. That was on Monday. There were only 3 days to get her small wardrobe ready and packed, and to ask the 1,000 questions concerning the Wesley girls (Graham was utterly forgotten) and the school. Then there were wonderful long talks with Mother, sitting close by her side, one hand tight in hers, solemn talks that were to linger in Jerry's heart all her life.
"I don't ever want to do anything, Mumsy, sweetheart, that'd make you the least little bit unhappy,"
Jerry had said, after one of those talks, suddenly pressing her mother's hand close to her cheek. On Wednesday afternoon she declared to Mr. John, when he drove over from Cobble, that she was
"ready."
She said it a little breathlessly. No crusader of old starting forth upon his holy way, felt any more exaltation of spirit than did Jerry.
I've packed and I've mended my coat, and I've finished Mother's comfy jacket that I began winter before last, and I've said good-bye to Rose and poor old Jimmy Chubb, who's awfully envious 'cause he wanted to go to Troy to work in his uncle's store, and he says it makes him mad to have a girl see the world 'fore he does, but I told him he ought to keep on at school, even if it was only Miller's Notch. And I've cleaned little Dad's pipes, and I've promised Big Boy and Pepperpot and Dormouse that they may all sleep on my bed tonight. I'm afraid Pepperpot, he's so sensitive, is going to miss me dreadfully.
Jerry tried to frown away the thought. She did not want it to intrude upon her joy. That last evening she sat quietly on the porch with one hand in her mother's and the other in little Dad's. Not one of them seemed to want to talk. Jerry was too excited, and her mother knew that she could not keep a tremble from her voice. At 9 o'clock Jerry declared that she'd just have to go to bed, so that the morning would come quicker. She kissed them both, kissed her mother again and again, then marched off with her pets at her heels. Far into the night her mother sat alone on the edge of the porch, staring at the stars through a mist of tears and praying, first that the Heavenly Father would protect her little Jerry always and always, and that then He would give her strength to let the child go on the morrow. When the parting came, everyone tried to be very busy and very merry, to cover the heartache that was under it all. John Wesley fussed with the covers and the cushions in the big car, and had his chauffeur pack and repack the bags. Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Travis discussed the lunch that had been stowed away in the tonneau, as though the whole thing was only a day's picnic. Jerry, a funny little figure in her coat that was too small, and a fall hat that Mrs. Chubb had made over from one of her mother's, was, with careful impartiality, bestowing final caresses upon Big Boy, Pepperpot, Silverheels, and her father and mother alike. Then, at the last moment, she almost strangled her mother with the sweep of her strong young arms.
Mumsy, sweetheart, if you want me dreadfully, you'll send for me?
She whispered, stricken for a moment by the realization that the parting was for a very long time. Then, though her heart was almost breaking within her, Mrs. Travis managed to laugh lightly.
"Need you? Of course we won't need you. Climb in, darling."
And she almost lifted the girl into the tonneau, where Mrs. Allen was already comfortably fixed. But at this moment Big Boy tried to leap into the car. When Dr. Travis gripped his collar, he let out a long, protesting howl.
"Oh, Big Boy, he knows! Let me say good-bye again,"
cried Jerry, jumping out and, to everyone's amusement, embracing the dog.
"You must be a good dog and take very good care of my sweetheart and little Dad,"
she whispered. Then, standing, she looked around.
"Where's Pepperpot?"
she asked anxiously. The little dog had disappeared.
"He'll think that I love Big Boy more than I do him,"
she explained as she climbed back in. The car started down the rough road. Jerry turned to wave. As long as she could see her mother and father, she kept her little white handkerchief fluttering. Then she faced resolutely forward.
"You know,"
she explained to John Wesley with shining eyes,
"when you've been wishing and wishing for something, you must enjoy it as hard as you can."
Even the familiar buildings of the Notch seemed different now to Jerry as she flew past them, and she kept finding new things all along the way. Then, as they turned from the rough country road into her shining road, which was, of course, the macadam highway, she looked back up toward Kettle to see if she could catch a glimpse of SunnySide, of the Witch's Glade, and the Wishing Rock. They were lost in a blaze of green and purple and brown.
"Isn't it funny? If I was up there watching, I'd see you moving away like a speck, and in a moment you'd disappear around the corner. And now I'm the speck, and I don't know when we reach the corner, but I'm going anyway."
Then, upon her happy meditations, came a sudden, startling interruption in the shape of a small dog that leaped out from the dense undergrowth at the side of the road and hailed the automobile with a sharp bark.
"Pepperpot!"
cried Jerry, springing to her feet. The chauffeur had brought the car to a sudden stop to avoid hitting the dog. At the sound of Jerry's voice, the little animal made a joyous leap into the car.
He came on ahead, through the divide. Oh, the darling!
And Jerry hugged her pet proudly. John Wesley looked at Penelope Allen, and she looked at him, and the chauffeur looked at them both, all with the same question. In Jerry's mind, however, there was no doubt.
He'll have to go with us, Mr. John, because I know he'd just die of a broken heart if I took him back.
Then, startled by John Wesley's hesitation, she added convincingly,
He'll be awfully good, and never bothers anyone, and keeps as still as can be when I tell him to, and I'll...
No one could have resisted the appeal in her voice.
Very well, Jerry. Pepperpot shall go too.
End of Chapter 5 of Highacres. Chapter 7 of Highacres by Jane Abbott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 7 of Highacres. Old Peter Wesley had made up his mind, so gossip said, to build Highacres when he heard that Thomas Knowles, a business rival, had bought a palatial home on the most beautiful avenue of the city. Poof! That was Uncle Peter's favorite expression, and he had a way of blowing it through his scraggly mustache that made it most impressive.
Poof! I'll show him.
The next morning he drove around to a real estate office, bundled the startled real estate broker into his car, and carried him off to the outskirts of the city, where lay a beautiful tract of land, advertised as Highacre Terrace, and held, with an eye to the growth of the city, at a startling figure. In the real estate office it had been divided into building lots with restrictions, which meant that only separate houses could be built on the lots. Peter Wesley struck the ground with his heavy cane and said he'd take the whole piece. The real estate man gasped. Uncle Peter said, "Poof!" again, and the deal was settled. Then he summoned architects from all over the country, who, to his delight, spent hours in the office of the Westley Cement Mixer Manufacturing Company trying to outdo one another in finesse and suavity. Fortunately, he decided upon a man who had genius as well as tact, who, without his knowing it, could quietly bend old Peter Wesley to his way of thinking. Under this man's planning, the new home grew until it stood in its finished perfection, a mass of stone and marble, surrounded by great trees and sloping lawns. Gossip said further that Highacres so far surpassed the remodeled home of Thomas Knowles that poor gentleman had resigned from the Meadowbrook Country Club so that he would not have to drive past it. What sentiment had led Peter Wesley to leave Highacres to the Lincoln School no one would ever know. Perhaps deep in his queer old heart was an affection for his nephew Robert's children, who came dutifully to see him once or twice a year, but made no effort to conceal the fact that they thought it a dreadful bore.
"I think,"
Isobel said seriously to her family as they were gathered around the breakfast table a few days after Jerry's arrival,
"that it'd be nice if Jip and I put on black."
"Black!"
cried Jip, spilling her cocoa in her astonishment.
"Yes, black. We should have worn it when Uncle Peter died, and now, going to school out there, it would show the others that we respected."
Mrs. Wesley laughed. Then, when she saw the color deepen in Isobel's cheeks, she added soothingly,
"Your thought's all right, Isobel dear, but it will be hardly necessary for you and Jip to put on black now to show your respect. I think every pupil of Lincoln can best do it by building up a reputation for scholarship that will make Lincoln known all over the country."
Isobel just wants everybody to remember she's Uncle Peter's.
"Hush, Gran."
Mrs. Wesley had a way of saying hush that cleared a threatening atmosphere at once.
"Oh, isn't it going to be fun?"
cried Jip.
"Mother, can't we take Jerry out there this morning?"
"But I have to use the car."
If you girls were fellows, we could walk,
broke in Graham.
We can! It's only 2.5 miles. Simpson watched on the speedometer the last time we drove out.
Graham looked questioningly at Jerry, and Jerry, suddenly recalling the miles of mountain trail over which she had climbed, laughed back her answer. Because a new world that surpassed any fairy tale had opened to Jerry in these last few days, it seemed only fitting to go to school in a building that was like a palace. She thrilled at the thought of the new school life, the girls and boys who would be her classmates, the new teachers, the new studies. For years and years, back at the Notch, she had always sat in front of Rose Smith and back of Jimmy Chubb. She had progressed from fractions to measurements and then on to algebra, and from spelling to Latin, with the outline of Jimmy's wing-like ears so fixed a part of her vision that she wondered if now she might not find that she could not study without them. And there had always been, as far back as she could remember, only little Miss Maston to teach multiplication and geography and algebra alike. She and the other children who made up the advanced grade of the school at Miller's Notch always called her Miss Sarah. Would there be anyone like Miss Sarah at Lincoln? As they walked along, Jip bravely measuring her step to Jerry's freer stride, Jip explained to Jerry all about Uncle Peter.
He's Father's uncle. Father's father, that's my grandfather, was his youngest brother. He died when he was just a young man, and Uncle Peter never got over it. Mother says my grandfather was the only person Uncle Peter ever really liked. He always lived in the same funny little old house, even after he made lots of money, until he built Highacres. He was terribly queer. I used to be dreadfully afraid of him because he always carried a big cane and had the awfullest way of looking at you. His eyes sort of bored holes right through you, so that you turned cold all over and couldn't even cry. I'm glad he's dead. He was awfully old anyway, or at least he looked old. We used to just hate to have to go see him. The old stingy wouldn't ever even give us a stick of candy.
The poor old man,
Jerry said so feelingly that Jip stared at her.
My mother always said that such people are so unhappy that they punish themselves. Maybe he really wanted to be nice and just didn't know how. Anyway, he's given his home to the school.
If Peter Wesley, looking down from another world, was reading that thought in 100 young hearts, he must surely be finding his reward.
There it is,
cried Graham, who was walking ahead. School could not really seem a bit like school, Jerry thought, as she followed the others through the spacious grounds into the building. When one studied in such beautiful rooms where the sun, streaming through long windows framed in richly toned walnut, danced in slanting gold bars across parquet floors. Jip's enthusiasm, though, made it all very real.
Here, Jerry, here's where the third form study room will be. Look, here's the geometry classroom. Oh, I hope we'll be put in the same class. Let's go down to the gym. Oh, look at the French room. Isn't it darling?
The trees outside were casting a shimmer of green through the sunshine in the room.
Mademoiselle will say, "Young ladies, it is beautiful." Aren't these halls jolly, Jerry? Oh, I can't wait for school to begin.
On their way to the gymnasium, which was in the new wing of the building, the girls met another group. One of these disentangled herself from the arms that encircled her waist and threw herself into Jip's embrace. The extravagance of her demonstration startled Jerry, but when Jip introduced her, in an offhand way,
"This is Ginny Cox, Jerry,"
Jerry found herself fascinated by the dash and camaraderie in the girl's manner. There were other introductions and excited greetings. Each tried to tell how scrumptious and gorgeous and spliffy she thought the new school. Like Jip, none of them could wait until school opened. Then the group passed on, and Jerry, breathless at her first encounter with her schoolmates-to-be, remembered only Ginny Cox.
"She's the funniest girl. She's a perfect circus,"
Jip explained in answer to Jerry's query.
"Everybody likes her, and she's the best forward we ever had in Lincoln."
All of which was strange tribute to Jerry's ears, for back at the Notch, poor Cy Roby had always been dubbed the funniest child in the school, and he had been simple. Jerry did not know exactly how valuable a good forward was to any school, but, she told herself, She knew she was going to like Jenny Cox. In the gymnasium, the girls found Graham with a group of boys. Jip greeted them boisterously. Jerry, watching shyly, thought them all very jolly-looking boys.
Do you see that tall boy down there?
Jip nodded toward another group.
That's Dana King. Isobel's got an awful crush on him. She won't admit it, but I know it, and the other girls say so too. He's a senior.
The boy turned at that moment. His pleasant face was aglow with enthusiasm.
"Come on, fellows,"
he cried to the other boys.
"Let's give a yell for old Peter Wesley."
And the yell was given with a will.
Lincoln! 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 Rah, rah, rah! Peter Wesley! Peter Wesley!
Jerry tingled to her fingertips. Jip had yelled with the others. So had Jenny Cox, who had come back into the room. What fun it was all going to be! Dana King was leading the boys in a serpentine march through the building. Out in the hall the line broke to force in a laughing, remonstrating carpenter. Jerry heard their boyish voices gradually die away.
Before we go back, let's climb up to the tower room.
That was the name the children had always given to the largest of the turrets that crowned Highacres' many-gabled roof. A stairway led directly to it from the third floor, but the door of the room was locked.
How tiresome!
Exclaimed Jip, shaking the knob. Not that she did not know just what the tower room was like, but she hated locked doors. They always made her so curious.
It's the nicest room. You can see way off over the city from its windows.
She gave the offending door a little kick.
They put all of Uncle Peter's old books and papers and things up here. Mother wouldn't have them brought to our house, you see. I remember she told Graham the key was down in the safety deposit box at the bank. Well...
Disappointed, Jip turned down the stairs.
I've always loved tower rooms, don't you, Jerry? They're so romantic. Can't you just see the poor princess who won't marry the lover her father has commanded her to marry, languishing up there, even chained to the wall?
Jerry shuddered, but loved the picture. She added to it,
"She's got long golden hair hanging down over her shoulders, and she's tearing it in her wretchedness.
And beating her breast, and vowing over and over that she will not marry the horrible, wicked prince.
And refusing to eat the dry bread that the ugly old keeper of the drawbridge slips through the door."
At this point in the heartrending story, the two laughing girls reached the outer door. Jip slipped an affectionate hand through Jerry's arm. She forgot the languishing princess she had consigned to the prison above in her joy of the bright sunshine, the inviting slopes of Highacres, velvety green, and the new friend at her side.
I'm so glad Uncle Johnny found you.
End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Highacres by Jane Abbott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 8. School. In the Wesley home each school day had always begun with a rite that would some day be a sacred memory to Mrs. Wesley, because it belonged to the precious childhood of her girls and boy. Graham called it inspection. It had begun when the youngsters had first started school. Isobel and Graham proudly in the grades, Jip in kindergarten. The mother had, each morning, laughingly stood them in a row and looked them over. More than once poor Graham had declared that it was because his ears were so big that Mother could always find dirt somewhere. Sometimes it was Isobel who was sent back to smooth her hair, or Jip to wash her teeth, or Tibby for her rubbers. But after the inspection there was always a good-luck kiss for each, and a carol of "Good-bye, Mother," from happy young throats. So on this day that was to mark the opening of the Lincoln School at Highacres, Jerry stood in line with the others, and, though each young person was faultlessly ready for this first day of school, Mrs. Wesley laughingly pulled Graham's ears, smiled reminiscently at Isobel's primness, smoothed with a loving hand Jip's rebellious black locks, and thought, as she looked at Jerry, of what Uncle Johnny had said about her eyes reflecting golden dreams from within. And when she called Tibby littlest one, none of them could know that, as she looked at them and realized that another year was beginning, it stirred a little heartache deep within her.
Aren't mothers funny?
Reflected Jip as she and Jerry swung down the street. They had preferred to walk.
Oh,
Jerry had to control her voice.
I think they're grand.
I mean, they're so fussy. When I have children, I'm just going to leave them plumb alone. I don't care what they'll look like.
You will, though,
laughed Jerry,
because you'll love them. If our mothers didn't love us so much, I suppose they'd leave us alone. That would be dreadful.
Jerry had slept very little the night before for anticipation, and now that the great moment was approaching close, she was obsessed by the fear that she wouldn't know what to do. The fear grew very acute when she was swept by Jip into a crowd of noisy girls, all rushing for space in the dressing rooms. Then, at the ringing of a bell, she was hurried with the others up the wide stairway. She caught a glimpse of Jip ahead, surrounded by chums, all trying to exchange in a brief moment the entire summer's experiences. She looked wildly around for a familiar face. She caught one little glimpse of Jenny Cox, who smiled at her across a dozen heads, then rushed away with the others. In the assembly room a spirit of gaiety prevailed. The eager faces of the boys and girls smiled at the faculty, sitting in prim rows on the stage. The faculty smiled back. There was stirring music until the last pupil had found her place. Then, just as Dr. Caton, the dignified principal, rose to his feet, a boy whom Jerry from her corner recognized as Dana King leaped to the front, threw both arms wildly in the air with a gesture that plainly commanded, "Come on, fellows!" and the beam ceiling rang with a lusty cheer. Dr. Caton greeted the students with a few pleasant words. There were more cheers. Then everyone sang. Jerry thought it all very jolly. She wondered if assembly was always like this. She recalled suddenly how agitated poor Miss Sarah always became if there was the slightest noise in that stuffy schoolroom back at the Notch.
"Look, there's the new gym teacher, on the end, Barbara Lee,"
whispered Jerry's neighbor excitedly. Jerry looked with interest. In the entire faculty she had not found anyone who resembled, even ever so slightly, poor Miss Sarah. Miller's Notch, of course, had no gymnasium. Therefore it had not needed any gymnasium assistant. Jerry had imagined that a gym teacher must necessarily be a sort of young Amazon with a strong, hard face. Miss Lee was slender and looked like one of the schoolgirls. It had always been the custom at Lincoln School on the opening day to assign the new pupils to the care of the seniors. These assignments were posted on the bulletin boards. Jerry did not know this. She did not know that Isobel Westley had been appointed her guardian. Before assembly, Isobel had read her name on the list and had promptly declared,
"It just won't. Let her get along the best way she can."
So when assembly was over, Jerry found herself drifting helplessly, forlornly elbowed here and there, too shy to ask questions, valiantly trying to beat down the desire to run away. She envied the assurance with which the others, even the new girls, seemed to know just where they ought to go. She had not laid eyes on Jip after that one fleeting glimpse on the stairs. Suddenly a hand touched her arm, and, turning, she found Barbara Lee beside her. The kind smile on Miss Lee's face brought a little involuntary quiver to her lips.
"Lost, my dear?"
I don't know where.
"You're a new girl. What is your name?"
Gerald Travis.
"Oh, yes. Where is your guardian?"
As she spoke, Miss Lee stepped to the bulletin board that hung in the corridor. She read Isobel's name.
"You were assigned to Isobel Westley. It is strange she has left you alone. Come to the library with me, Gerald."
Jerry realized now why it had been so easy for all the other new girls to find their places. They had guardians. She tried to smother a little feeling of hurt because Isobel had deserted her. The library, gloriously sunlit on this golden morning, was empty. Miss Lee pulled 2 chairs toward a long table.
Sit here, Gerald. Now, tell me all about your other school so we can place you.
And she patted Jerry's head in a jolly, encouraging way. It was very easy for Jerry to talk to Miss Lee. She told of the work she had covered back at the Notch. Miss Lee listened with interest, and knowing nothing of Jerry's home life and Jerry's mother, some amazement.
I believe you could go straight into the junior class, though you're—
"Oh, can't I be in Jip's room?"
cried Jerry in dismay.
Jip Wesley, I mean. You see, she's the only girl I know real well.
Barbara Lee, for all that she was trying to look very grown-up and dignified, as a teacher should, could remember well how much it meant in school life to be near one's chum. So she laughed, a laugh that warmed Jerry's heart.
I think perhaps that can be arranged,
she said in a tone that indicated that she would help.
We will go see Dr. Catton.
Even after the long consultation with Dr. Caton, Miss Lee did not desert Jerry. As they walked away from the office, she whispered assuringly to Jerry,
Dr. Catton thinks you had better go into the 3rd form room for a term at least.
Accordingly, she led her into one of the smaller study rooms. And there was Jip smiling and beckoning her to an empty desk beside her. But Miss Lee took Jerry to her classrooms. She introduced her to Miss Briggs, the geometry teacher, then to Miss Gray of the English department, and on to the French room, and to the ancient history classroom. Bewildered, Jerry answered countless questions and registered her name over and over.
There, my dear, you're settled for this term at least,
declared Miss Lee as they left the last classroom.
Now, go back to your study room and take that desk that Jip Wesley's been saving for you.
Assigned to classes, and with the desk of her own, and with Jip close at hand, Jerry felt like a real Lincolnite, and her unhappy shyness vanished as though by magic. During the long recess that followed, the bad half-hour forgotten, with a budding confidence born of her sense of belonging, she sought the other new girls. Among them was Patricia Everett, who came directly to Jerry.
I know you're Jerry Travis. I'm Aunt Pen Everett, Ellen's niece. I'm crazy to go and visit Cobble Mountain. That's very near your home, isn't it?
So sincere was her interest that Jerry felt as though she was suddenly surrounded by a wealth of friendship. Patricia seemed to know everyone else. They were nearly all Girl Scouts in her troop. She introduced Jerry to so many girls that poor Jerry could not remember a single name. Jenny Cox, spying Jerry from across the room, bolted to her.
You're going to sign up for basketball, aren't you? Of course you are. Wait right here. I'll call Mary Starr.
She rushed away, and before Jerry could catch her breath, she returned with a tall, pleasant-faced girl who carried a small leather-bound notebook in her hand. She wrote Jerry's name in it and went away.
Miss Travis, will you sign up for hockey?
Jerry, on familiar ground, eagerly assented to this. Her name went into another book. Another girl waylaid her. She signed for swimming. She noticed that the others around her were doing the same thing. Patricia brought a girl to her whom she introduced as Peggy Lee. Peggy carried a notebook too.
Will you sign up for the debating club, Miss Travis?
She asked with a dignity that was belied by her roguish eyes. Jerry was quite breathless. She had never debated in her life, but then she had never played basketball either.
Oh, do sign. We're all joining, and it's awfully exciting,
pleaded Patricia. So Jerry signed for the debates.
Whenever will I find time to study Latin and geometry? I know I'm going to be dumb in that,
cried Jerry that evening to the Wesley family. She spoke with such real conviction that everyone laughed. Uncle Johnny had dropped in. He was as eager as though he was a schoolboy himself to hear the children's experiences of the day. Though they all talked at once, he managed to understand nearly all that they were telling.
And you, Jerry girl, what did you think of it all?
Because she had felt like one little drop in a very big puddle, Jerry simply couldn't tell. But her eyes were shining. Jip broke in.
Jerry could be a junior if she wanted to, but she's going to stay in my study room for a while, and they've signed her up for every single thing.
Jerry, ignorant of Lincoln traditions, did not know that this was a tribute. Then she had wondered when, with everything else, she would find time for her Cicero and geometry.
Who you got? Speck eyes?
Graham!
cried Mrs. Wesley.
I will not have you speaking in that way of your teachers.
Graham colored. He knew that this was a point upon which his mother had always been very firm.
Oh, Miss Briggs is all right. I like her, but all the fellows call her that.
Do you suppose they'll nickname Miss Lee?
To Jerry it seemed that that would be sacrilege. She was too dear. Uncle John had, then, to hear all about her. He was much interested. He had not realized that she was grown up enough to teach.
But she really doesn't seem a bit so,
Jip explained. Then, quite suddenly, Graham asked Jerry,
Say, Jerry, who was your guardian?
Jerry's face turned very red. She caught a defiant look from Isobel. She did not want to answer. Even the ethics of the little school at Miller's Notch had no tolerance for a telltale.
A senior. She couldn't find me.
Poor Jerry. Graham's careless inquiry had dimmed her enthusiasm. Why hadn't Isobel found her? With the friendliness of spirit that was such a part of the very atmosphere of Lincoln, why had Isobel alone stood aloof? She looked at Isobel. She was so pretty now as she talked, with animation, to Uncle Johnny. Jerry thought, as she watched her, that she'd rather have Isobel love her than any of those other nice girls she had met at Highacres, Patricia Everett, Jenny Cox, Peggy Lee, Kenneth Randolph.
I'll just make her,
she vowed, gathering up her shiny new school books. And that solemn vow was to help Jerry over many a rough spot in the school days to come. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 16 of Highacres. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Highacres by Jane Abbott. Chapter 16. For the Honor of the School.
Oh, I am sick of winter. I wish I was a cannibal living on a tropical island eating coconuts.
Missionaries, you mean?
Laughed Isobel. Virginia Cox threw her skates over her shoulder. Isobel, Dorry Carr, and herself were the last to leave the lake. The school grounds were deserted.
Oh, look at the snowman someone started,
cried Jenny as they walked through the grounds.
Say, this is spliffy snow to pack. Let's finish up the work of art.
In her enthusiasm over her suggestion, her ennui was forgotten.
I know. Let's make him into a snow lady.
Jenny's fingers were clever. Her caricatures, almost always drawn in ridicule of the faculty or her fellow classmates, were famous. If in her makeup she had a kindlier spirit and a truer sense of the beautiful, she might have become a great artist or sculptor. Now she worked feverishly, shaping a lifelike figure from the huge cakes of snow that the others brought to her. As she stood back to view her handiwork, a naughty thought flashed into her mind.
Girls, it's going to be Miss Gray. And my mother's got a funny old lavender crocheted shawl like that thing Miss Gray wears when it's cold that the moths won't even eat. And I can fix a hat like that dreadful chapeau of hers that came out of the Ark. And glasses, too.
Isobel and Dorry laughed delightedly.
How can you get them out here?
Oh, I'll find a way.
Jenny always could.
Do you think that nose is pug enough?
She deftly packed it down on each side with a finger, then gave a quick upward touch.
Isn't that better?
Her companions declared the likeness perfect, as far as snow could make it.
And I can hunt up 2 blue glass allies for eyes.
There was plainly no end to Jenny's resourcefulness.
You just wait and see what you'll see in the morning.
During the night, King Winter maliciously abetted Jenny in her work, for a turn in his temper laid a sparkling crust over everything, and especially the little snow lady who waited immovable on a little rise of ground near the main entrance of the school. The pupils, arriving in Highacres the next morning, rubbed their eyes in amazement. Not one failed to recognize the English teacher in the funny shawl-draped figure, with enormous glasses framing round blue eyes, shadowed by a hat that was almost an exact counterpart of the shabby one Miss Gray had hung each morning for the past 3 winters on her peg in the dressing-room. But there was something about the rakish tilt of the hat that was in such strange contrast to the severe spectacles and the thin, frosty nose, that it gave the Snow Lady the appearance of staggering, and made her very funny. All through the school session, groups of pupils gathered at the windows, laughing. There was much speculating as to who had built the Snow Lady. The three little sub-freshmen who had begun the work Jenny had finished were vehement in their assertions that they had not. Gradually it was whispered about that Jenny Cox had done it.
We might have known that.
Several laughed, thinking Jenny very clever. Then over those invisible currents of communication which convey news through a school faster than a flame can spread, came the rumor that trouble was brewing. One of the monitors had told Dorry Carr that Miss Gray had had hysterics in the office, that in the midst of them she had written out her resignation, and that, after the first period, not an English class had been held. Another added the information that Barbara Lee had quieted Miss Gray with spirits of ammonia, and that Dr. Caton had refused to accept her resignation, and had been overheard to say that the culprit would be punished severely. Jenny's prank began to assume serious proportions. Jenny was more thoughtless than unkind. It had not crossed her mind that she might offend little Miss Gray. But she was not brave either. She had not the courage to go straight to Miss Gray and apologize for her careless, thoughtless act. There had been, for a number of years, one well-established punishment at Lincoln. Privileges were taken away from offenders, the term of the sentences depending upon the enormity of the offense. And privileges included many things: sitting in the study room, mingling with the other pupils in the lunch rooms at recess, sharing the school athletics. This system had all the good points of suspension, with the added sting of having constantly to parade one's disgrace before the eyes of the whole school.
If Jenny Cox is found out, she can't play in the game against the South High,
was on more than one tongue. Jip, deeply impressed by the criticalness of the situation, summoned a meeting of the Ravens. Her face was very tragic.
Girls, it's the chance for the Ravens to do something for the Lincoln School. We've had nothing but spreads and good times, and now the opportunity has come to test our loyalty.
Not one of the unsuspecting Ravens guessed what Jip had in mind.
Jenny Cox did build that Snow Lady. Isobel saw her. But if she gives herself up, she'll be sent to Siberia.
Well, it'll serve her right. She needn't have picked out poor little Miss Gray to make fun of.
Jip frowned at the interruption.
Of course not. We all know about Miss Gray and feel sorry for her, but Jenny doesn't. And anyway, that isn't the point. I was talking about loyalty to Lincoln.
Jip made her tone very solemn.
Disgrace. Everlasting, eternal black disgrace threatens the very foundations of our school.
She paused eloquently.
Next week, Tuesday, our All Lincoln's girls' basketball team plays our deadly enemy, South High. And what will happen without Jenny Cox? Who else can make the basket she can? Defeat, ignominious defeat, will be our sad lot.
Her voice trailed off in a wail that found its echo in every Raven's heart.
I'd forgotten the game. What a shame.
Why couldn't Jenny have thought of that?
Maybe Doc Canton will just let her play that once.
Not he. He's like iron. Didn't he send Bob Morley down for 3 whole days just before the Thanksgiving game, 'cause he got up in Caesar class and translated about the Gaelic wars?
Jip sensed the psychological moment strike.
Never before in the history of our secret order has such an opportunity to serve our school been given to us.
What can we do?
One of us can offer ourselves on the altar of loyalty.
Her meaning, stripped of its eloquent verbiage, slowly dawned upon 6 minds. A murmur of protest threatened to become a roar. Jip hastily dropped her fine oratory and pleaded humbly,
It's so little for one of us to do compared to what it means, and if we didn't do it and South High beat us, why, we'd suffer lots more with remorse than we would with just taking Jenny's punishment for her. Anyway, what did the promise we solemnly made mean? Nothing? We're a nice bunch. I'm perfectly willing to take Jenny Cox's place, but I think each Raven ought to have the chance, and we should draw lots.
Yes, that would be the fairest way.
agreed Pat Everett in a tone that suggested someone had died just the moment before.
I always draw the unlucky number in everything,
shivered Peggy Lee.
There'll have to be 2 this time, then, for I always do, too,
groaned a Sister Raven.
Shall we do it, girls? Shall we prove to the world that we ravens can make any sacrifice for our school?
Yes.
Came thickly from paralyzed throats. In a dead silence, Jip and Pat prepared 7 slips of paper. 6 were blank. Upon the 7th, Pat drew a long snake with head uplifted, ready to strike. The slips were carefully folded and shaken in Jerry's hat. Jip put the hat in the middle of the room.
Let's each one go up with her eyes shut tight and draw a slip. Then don't open it until the last one has been drawn.
They all agreed. If they had to do it, they might as well make the ceremony as much of a torture as possible. So horrible was the suspense that a creaking board made the ravens jump. A shutter slamming somewhere in another part of the building almost precipitated a panic. After an interval that seemed hours, each raven sat with a white slip in her nervous fingers.
Now, 1, 2, 3, open!
cried Jip. Another moment of silence, a sharp intake of breath, a rattle of paper. Then,
"Oh, I have it!"
cried Jerry in a small, frightened voice. End of chapter 16. Chapter 20 of Highacres. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Highacres by Jane Abbott. Chapter 20. The Family Councils. Uncle Johnny laid Peter Westley's letter down. A silence held them all. It was as though a voice from some other world had been speaking to them. Mrs. Westley shivered.
"How I hate money!"
she cried impulsively. Then, the very comfort and luxury of the room reproaching her, she added,
"I mean, I hate to think that wherever big fortunes are made, so many are ground down in the process."
Graham was frowning at the letter.
Of course you're going to hunt up this fellow,
he asked anxiously, a dull red flushing his cheeks.
Wasn't that as bad as stealing?
Maybe he's dead now, and it's too late,
cried Jip, who thought the whole thing full of intensely interesting possibilities.
Uncle Peter cannot defend himself now, Graham, so let us not pass judgment upon what he has done. And I don't suppose I can act on this matter until your father comes home.
"Oh, John, I know he will want to carry out his Uncle Peter's wish. You need not wait. Too much time has been lost already,"
urged Mrs. Westley. Graham was standing in front of the fire, his back to the blaze. It struck Uncle Johnny and his mother both that there was a new manliness in the slim, straight figure.
I want to help find him. It's when you know about such tricks and cheating and injustices that you hate this trying to make money. I think things ought to be divided up in this world, and every fellow given an equal chance.
John Wesley laid his hand on the boy's shoulder.
Real justice is the hardest thing to find in this world, Sonny. But keep the thought of it always in your mind, and look out for the rights of the other fellow. Then you'll never make the mistakes Uncle Peter did.
Poor old man. All he cared about in the world was making money, and then in his old age it gave him no joy, only torment, and he'd killed everything else in him that might have brought him a little happiness. I'm glad you and Robert aren't like him,"
Mrs. Westley added.
I am too,
cried Jip so fervently that everyone laughed.
How do you find people?
Put in Tibby, who was trying very hard to understand what it was all about.
It will be somewhat like the needle in the haystack. Boston is a big place, and a lot can happen in, let me see, that must have been 15 years ago.
Will you hire detectives?
Jip was quivering with the desire to help hunt down the mysterious Craig Winton.
I don't want to. I've always had a sort of distrust of detectives, and yet we may have to. We have so little to start on. I'll get Stevens and Murray together tomorrow. Perhaps they can tell me more about the buying of the patent, and I'll have Watkins recommend some reliable Boston attorney.
Uncle John's voice sounded as though he meant business. Isobel had said nothing during the little family council. She suddenly lifted her head, her eyes dark with disapproval.
Won't giving this person all that money make us poor?
Something in her tone sent a little shock through the others.
My dear,
protested her mother.
Oh, you'd go on cheating him just like Uncle Peter. That's like you just think about yourself,
accused Graham disgustedly.
Do you want tainted money?
cried Jip grandly. Isobel's face flamed.
You're hateful, Graham Wesley. I don't like money a bit better than you do. You'd be squealing if you couldn't get that new motorcycle and go to camp and spend all the money you do. And I think it's silly to hunt him up after all this time. He's probably invented a lot of things since and doesn't need any money. And if he hasn't, well, inventors are always poor anyway.
Isobel tried to make her logic sound as reasonable to the others as it did to her.
Bonnie, dear.
That was the name Uncle Johnny had given to her in nursery days. He had not used it for a long time.
There are 2 reasons why we must carry out the wish Uncle Peter has expressed in his letter. One is because he has asked it. He thought he would have time to give the letter to us himself, perhaps tell us more about it. He did not dream that it would lie for 2 years in that Bible. The other reason is that it is the honorable thing to do, and it not only involves the honor of Uncle Peter's name, but your father's honor and mine, your brother's, yours, Graham's, even little Tibby's. We would do it if it took our last cent. But it won't.
Oh, Uncle Johnny, you're great.
Graham suddenly turned his face to the fire to hide his feelings.
When I'm a man, I want to be just like you and Father.
Isobel would not let herself be persuaded to accept her family's point of view. In her heart there still rankled the thought that Uncle Johnny had taken Barbara Lee with him to Highacres and had made her stay at home. And it had been silly for them all to get so excited and make such a fuss over Jip and Jerry. They might have known that they'd turn up all right. When she had seen Uncle Johnny pull Jerry down to a seat beside him on the davenport, she had hated her. Mrs. Wesley followed John Wesley to the little room that was always called Father's study.
Won't it be exciting hunting up this Craig Winton?
Jip asked the others.
Isn't it an interesting name? Maybe he'll have a lot of children. I hope there'll be some girls.
Jip hugged her knees in an ecstasy of anticipation.
If they're dreadfully poor, it'll be like they're finding a fairy godmother. Think of all they can have with that money.
All I hope,
Isobel's voice rang cruelly clear,
is that Uncle Johnny won't want to bring any more charity girls here.
She rose then, and without looking at any of them, walked from the room. Jip opened her lips to speak, then closed them quickly. Whatever she might say, she knew instinctively, would only add to the hurt Isobel had inflicted. She could not even throw her arms around Jerry's neck and hug her the way she wanted to do, because the expression of Jerry's face forbade it. It was a very terrible expression, Jip thought, a little frightened. Jerry's eyes glowed with such a fierce pride, and yet were so hurt. After a moment, Jerry said slowly,
I am going to bed.
Jip wished that Graham would say something, and Graham wished Jip would say something, and both sat tongue-tied while Jerry walked out of the room.
You think we ought to tell Mother?
Jip asked in a hushed voice.
No.
Graham hated the thought of tale-bearing.
But Isobel's an awful snob. It's her going around with Cora Stanton and Amy Mathers.
To think this gave some comfort to Graham and Jip.
Well, I don't know what Jerry will do,
sighed Jip forlornly. The door of Jerry's room was shut, and Jip had not the courage to open it. She listened for a moment outside it. There was not a sound from within. She went into her own room and undressed slowly, with a vague uneasiness that something was going to happen. There had been no sound in Jerry's room because she had been standing rigid in the window, staring with burning, angry eyes out into the darkness. Her beautiful, happy world, that she had thought so full of kindness and good fellowship, had turned suddenly upside down. Charity girl. She did not know just what it meant, but it made her think of homeless, nameless, unloved waifs, motherless, fatherless, dependent upon the world's generosity. Her hand went to her throat. Charity girl! Was not her beloved SunnySide, with sweetheart and little Dad, richer and more beautiful than anything on earth? And hadn't she always had? Like a flash, though, she saw herself in the queerly fashioned brown dress that had seemed very nice back at Miller's Notch, but very funny when contrasted with the pretty, simple serge dresses that the other girls at Highacres wore. Perhaps they had all thought she was a charity girl, a waif brought here by Uncle Johnny. To be sure, her schoolmates had welcomed her into all their activities, but perhaps they had felt sorry for her, and anyway, it had been after Uncle Johnny had given her the Christmas box. She looked down at the dress she wore. It was the school dress that had been in the box. Perhaps she should not have taken it. Taking it may have made her a charity girl. She should never have come here. It was costing someone money to send her to Highacres and to feed her, and often Mrs. Wesley gave little things to her, and none of this she could repay. With furious fingers, Jerry unfastened and tore off the Christmas dress. From its hook in her clothes closet, she took down the despised brown garment. Her only thought, then, was to sort out her very own possessions. But as she collected the few things, the plan to go away, anywhere, took shape in her mind. She would go to Barbara Lee until her mother could send for her. Then her door opened slowly. On the threshold stood Jip in her red dressing-gown. It was not so dark but that Jip could see that Jerry wore her old brown dress, and that she held her hat in her hand. With one bound she was at her friend's side, holding her arm tightly.
Jerry, you're not going away! You're not!
I've got to. I won't be.
You're not whatever Isobel said. She's horrid. She's jealous of you because of Dana King, and everybody thinks you're the most popular girl at Lincoln. Peggy Lee said she heard a crowd of girls saying so, that it was 'cause you're always nice to everybody, and 'cause you like to do everything. I won't let you go.
There was something very stubborn in Jip's dark face. Jerry wished she had not come in. Just before, it had seemed so easy to slip away to Barbara Lee's, and now...
I should never have come here. I should never have let you all...
Jip gave her chum a little shake.
Jerry Travis, Uncle Johnny brought you 'cause he said he knew you could give Lincoln School and Isobel and me a lot, of something, and Mother read it in his letter. I remember. He said it was like a sort of scholarship. And I heard Mother tell him the day I was teasing her to let me cut my hair short like yours, that she'd be willing to let me do anything if I could learn to be as sunny as you are. I heard her 'cause I was listening to see if she was going to let me. So you've more than paid for everything. There's something more than just money. You're too proud. You're prouder than Isobel herself.
Jerry dropped her hat on the bed. Jip took it as a promising sign, and she closed her arms tight around Jerry's shoulders.
If you go away, it will break my heart,
she declared.
I love you more than any chum I ever had. More than anybody, except my family, of course, and I love them differently, so it doesn't count. And Mother loves you too, and so does Tibby, and so does Uncle Johnny. And if you don't tell me right off that you won't go away, I'll go straight to Mother, and then we'll have to tell her how nasty Isobel was, and that'll make her unhappy. And I mean it.
There was no doubt of that. Jip's concluding argument broke down Jerry's determination to go. No, she could not. As Jip had said, if she went away, Mrs. Wesley and Uncle Johnny must know why. She could not do a single thing that would make either of them the least unhappy. That would be poor gratitude. Perhaps Jip was right, too, that she was too proud. Surely her mother would never have let her come if it was going to bring the least humiliation to her. Jip, with quick fingers, began to unbutton the brown dress.
Let's just show Isobel that we don't care what she says. I think it's that horrid, Cora Stanton and Amy Mathers, that makes her act so anyway. They're horrid. Amy Mathers puts peroxide on her hair, and Cora Stanton cheated in the geometry exam. Everyone says so. I know what let's do, Jerry. There were some cupcakes left. I saw them in the pantry. Let's go down ever so quietly and get them, and we'll have a spiffy spread.
As she spoke, she caught up Jerry's warm eider-down wrapper and threw it around her. Jip's devotion was very soothing to poor distraught Jerry. So, too, was the suggestion of the cupcakes. But halfway down the stairs, Jerry stopped short and whispered tragically in Jip's ear,
Jip, We can't eat them. Our school record. No sweets between meals.
And at the thought of school, Jerry's world suddenly righted again.
Oh, well.
Jip would have liked to suggest a missing point.
We can eat crackers and peanut butter instead.
End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Highacres. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Highacres by Jane Abbott. Chapter 21. Poor Isobel. The rawness of March gave way to a half-hearted April, days of pelting rain, with a few hours now and then of warm sunshine. Patches of grass showed green against the dirty snowbanks lingering stubbornly in sheltered corners. Here and there a tiny purple or yellow crocus put up its bright head. A few brave robins started their nest-keeping, and, perched shivering on bare boughs, valiantly sung the promise of spring. There were other signs to mark the changing of the seasons. An organ grinder trundled his way down the street. Rag pickers chanted. Small, scurrying figures darted in and out on roller skates. Marbles rattled in ragged pockets. And the Lincoln boys and girls at Highacres turned their attention from basketball and hockey to swimming and the school dramatics. Isobel Wesley had been chosen to play the part of Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Her family shared her pleasure. They felt that a great distinction had come to them. Jip and Jerry, particularly, were immensely excited. Jerry, who had only been to the theater twice in her life, thought Isobel far more wonderful than the greatest actress who ever lived. Both girls sat by the hour and listened admiringly while Isobel rehearsed her lines before them. Mrs. Wesley, who had never quite outgrown a love of amateur dramatics, gave her approval to Isobel's plans for her costume. The other girls, Isobel explained, were making theirs, but Hermia's should be especially nice. So couldn't Madame Seeley design it? Madame Seeley did design it, Isobel standing patiently before the long mirror in the fashionable modiste fitting room, while Madame herself, on her knees, pinned and unpinned and pinned again soft folds of pink satin which made Isobel's face, above it, reflect the color of a rose.
You'd think the whole world revolved round your old play,
exclaimed Graham, not ill-humoredly. He had asked to be allowed to use the car to take a crowd of the fellows out to see if any sap was running in the woods, and Mrs. Wesley had explained that Isobel had to have her last fitting, stop at the hairdresser's to try on a wig, and then go on to Alding's to match a pair of slippers.
It does,
laughed Isobel back, her eyes shining. She was very happy, and when she was happy, she was a gay, good-natured Isobel, and a very beautiful Isobel. All through the school year, her spirit had smarted under the prominence attained by her schoolmates in the various school activities. Jenny Cox was conspicuous in everything, and on the honor roll besides. Peggy Lee played hockey and basketball. Dory was in the glee club. Pat Everett was lieutenant in her scout troop. Cora Stanton was editor of the school paper. Sheila Quinn was the class president. Even Jip was a sub on the all-school basketball team. And Jerry, since that day she had skied down Haskin's Hill, she had pushed her way into everything. That was the way Isobel thought of it. She played on the hockey team and had subbed on the sophomore basketball team, and it was certain she would be picked on the swimming team. Though Isobel scorned all these activities because they were not any fun, according to her creed, deep in her heart she had envied the girls who could enjoy them. But now her vanity was soothed and satisfied. Anyone could play basketball or skate or swim, but no one could be the Hermia that she was going to be. Miss Gray had complimented her upon the interpretation she gave the role, and her eyes told her what she saw in Madame Seeley's mirror. And Dana King was playing Lysander, a fine Athenian lad he made. Isobel could afford now to forget the grudge she had nursed against him ever since the Christmas party. He looked so really grown up that it pleased her to be a little shy with him, as though she had just met him, to forget that they had been schoolmates since kindergarten days. She read admiration in his eyes. What would he think, she said to herself with a little flutter, when he saw the rose-pink costume? "Isobel Wesley, what fun to have a rehearsal every afternoon," had cried one of a group of girls which surrounded her.
"Does Lysander walk home with Hermia every day?"
asked another with a meaning laugh.
"Tell us all about it,"
coaxed Amy Mathers.
"It's too romantic for anything."
Isobel blushed and laughed and pushed them away. She knew that they all envied her. She wanted them to envy her. She knew that any one of them would gladly change places with her. Even Jip and Jerry had sighed and begged their mother to help them get up some sort of play in which they could take part. Jip had asked Miss Gray to be allowed to help in the make-up room, even if she did nothing more than pass the little jars of cream and sticks of paint. And to Jerry had been assigned the special task of shoving Puck, who was sadly rattle-brained, upon the stage when the cues came. The play was to be given on Saturday evening. On Friday evening a full-dress rehearsal was called. Hermia's costume was finished and was spread, in all its ravishing beauty, across the guest-room bed. On the floor from beneath it peeped the slippers which had been made to order.
"It'll make all the others look cheap,"
declared Isobel, thrilling at the pretty sight. Mrs. Wesley looked troubled. Certain doubts had been disturbing her ever since that first moment of enthusiasm when she had yielded to Isobel's coaxing. Isobel had said that the other girls were making their own costumes. She knew that the faculty disliked any extravagance or great expenditures of money in any of the school affairs. Might it not have been better to have helped Isobel fashion something simple and pretty at home? Then, when she watched Isobel's flushed, happy face, radiantly pretty, she smothered her doubt.
"Pride goeth before a fall, daughter mine. Take care that your costume doesn't make you forget your part."
She laughed. After all, Isobel was so pretty that she would outshine the others, anyway, let her costume be ever so dowdy. Jip, Jerry, Tibby, even Graham superintended Isobel's preparations for the dress rehearsal. Jip sat back on her heels and declared that Hermia was good enough to eat. Jerry thought so too, though she had not the courage to say so. Graham straddled the footboard of the bed and passed scathing remarks concerning girls' duds, but his eyes were proudly admiring, and in his pocket he treasured a ticket for the first row that he had bought from another fellow at an advanced price. Isobel ready, they all squeezed merrily into the automobile, taking care not to crush the rose-pink finery, and whirled off to Highacres. Isobel, who loved dramatic situations in real life quite as well as in make-believe, planned to conceal her radiance until her first appearance on the stage, when she would startle them all, and especially Lysander, with her dazzling loveliness. She stood in the shadow of the wings with her coat wrapped about her. Except for Jerry, waiting to do her humble part, she was alone. She listened to the ceaseless chatter in the dressing-room with a happy smile. She heard Mr. Oliver, the coach, giving sharp orders. There was some trouble with the curtain. She took a quick step forward to see what it was. The high heel of her satin slipper caught in a coil of rope from the staging, and she fell forward to her knees. With the one thought to save the satin gown, she jerked her body quickly backward.
"Oh, Isobel, are you hurt?"
Jerry was at her side in a moment.
"No, only—"
Isobel managed to get to her feet, but she leaned dizzily against the scene propping.
"Whoever left that old rope here, they ought to be reported."
She glared angrily at poor Jerry, as though the fault must be hers.
I've ruined my dress."
She sobbed. Jerry examined the satin skirt.
There isn't the tiniest spot, Isobel. But are you sure you are not hurt? Please try to walk.
That was exactly what Isobel did not want to do, for there was a horrible aching pain around her knee. Then she heard Mr. Oliver's voice again. The curtain had been fixed. In a moment,
Leave me alone. You'd just like it if I couldn't go on.
Isobel! Oh, there you are!
Dana King stuck his head around the corner. Isobel let her cape drop to the floor. The whiteness of her face only added to the pleasing effect.
Whew!
Lysander whistled.
Some class! Say, you're great! Come on, old Oliver's throwing a fit.
With Jerry's anxious eyes and Dana King's admiring gaze upon her, it was possible for Isobel to walk out upon the stage. Somehow or other she got through her part, miserably, she knew, for again and again Mr. Oliver made her repeat her lines, and once, in despair, stopped everything to ask her if she was ill, and did not wish to have Miss Lee take her part. Isobel did not intend giving up her part to anyone. She gritted her little white teeth and went on. Upon arriving home, she declined the hot cocoa Mrs. Wesley had waiting for her, and hurried to her room on the plea of being very tired. She sat huddled in her dressing gown, waiting, with a white, strained face, until she heard the girl's steps on the stairs. Then she called Jerry.
Close the door.
She whispered, without further greeting.
I want you to promise not to tell Mother or anyone that I hurt myself. I didn't hurt myself. Much, anyway. I'm going to be in that play if I die.
Isobel had hard work to keep back the tears. Jerry was all sympathy.
I won't tell anyone, Isobel, if you don't want me to. And let me look at your knee. It is your knee, isn't it? I know a lot about those things, 'cause little Dad's a doctor, you see.
Jerry knelt by the side of Isobel's chair and gently drew aside the dressing gown.
Oh, Isobel!
She cried softly. The knee was badly swollen, and the flesh had discolored.
That looks... Maybe you ought...
Isobel jerked away from her.
If you're going to make a fuss, you can go to bed. But if you know anything... Oh, it hurts terribly.
Without another word, Jerry went after hot water and towels. Half through the night she sat by Isobel's bed, her eyes heavy with sleep, patiently administering pack after pack. Gradually the pain subsided, and Isobel dropped off into slumber. All the next day Isobel's secret weighed heavily on Jerry's conscience. With it, too, was an uncertain admiration for Isobel's grit. But Jerry wondered if she, even though she might be the Hermia that Isobel was, and wear the rose satin, could want it enough to endure the pain silently. Isobel had begged to be allowed to stay in bed all day and rest, and her mother had willingly acquiesced, carrying her meals to her room and chatting with her, unsuspecting, while she nibbled at what was on the tray. Jerry helped Isobel dress. The pain caused by the effort to stand on the injured leg brought a deep flush to Isobel's cheeks and tiny purplish shadows under her pretty eyes, so that she made even a lovelier Hermia than on the evening before. That knowledge, the murmur of admiration that swept through the crowded hall, the envy she read on the other girls' faces, the shy, boyish wonder in Lysander's lingering glance, helped her through the agony of it all, until the very end, when, quite suddenly, she crumpled into Lysander's quickly outstretched arms. The last scene had a touch of reality not expected. No one had the presence of mind to ring down the curtain. The girls and boys rushed pell-mell upon the stage. Graham and Dana King carried Isobel to an empty classroom, where she quickly regained consciousness. Her first sensation was a deep thankfulness that the play was over, and that she could tell about her injured knee. Jerry had already done so, a little conscience-smitten, and Uncle Johnny had rushed away for a doctor. Isobel looked at her crumpled rose-pink skirts with something akin to loathing, and clung tightly to her mother's hand. Graham, in a voice that sounded far off, was assuring her that he could carry her out to the car without hurting her the least bit. And Dana King was asking, at regular intervals and in an anxious voice, if she felt better. Oh, it was nice to have them all care. It made the pain easier. She liked the funny bright light swimming all around her, and the quick steps and the hushed voices. Mrs. Hicks's little round eyes blinking at her, the feel of the soft sheets, and the doctor's cold touch on her poor swollen knee, the swinging things before her eyes, and the far-off hum of voices that were really very close, and the tiny star of light over the blur in the other end of the room, the million stars, the slippery taste of the medicine someone gave her, and always Mother's fingers tight about her own.
"This is very serious,"
came in a small voice that couldn't be the doctor's because he spoke with a deep boom. Then she went to sleep. End of chapter 21. Chapter 23 of Highacres. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Highacres by Jane Abbott. Chapter 23. The Third Violinist.
Hello, is that you, Jip? I want Centre 2115, please. Is this Mr. Wesley's house? Is that you, Jip? This is Pat Everett. Listen.
Came excitedly over the wire, though Jip was listening as hard as she could.
Peg and I found the black and white man.
Jip declared afterwards that the announcement had made her tingle to her toes. Immediately she corralled Jerry, whom she found translating Latin with a dictionary on her lap and a terrible frown on her brow, and together they hurried to Pat's house. It was a soft May evening. The air was filled with the throaty twitter of robins, the trees arched feathery green against the twilight sky. Pat and Peggy sat bareheaded on the steps of the Everett house, waiting for them. A great fragrant flowering honeysuckle brushed their shoulders. A more perfect setting could not have been found for the finish of their conspiracy. Pat plunged straight into her story.
Peg and I were coming back from Dalton's bookstore, and we ran bang into the man. He'd taken his hat off because it was so warm and was fanning himself with it. We both saw it at exactly the same moment, and we just turned and clutched each other and almost yelled.
"And then what? Why didn't you grab him?"
As if we could lay our hands on a perfect stranger. Anyway, we've got to be tactful, but I'm sure it's the one. There was a white streak that ran right back from the front of his face, and he was very handsome too. At least, we decided he would be if we were as old as Miss Grey. I thought he was a little, biggish.
"And to think how we've hunted for him, and he was right here."
Then Jip realized that Pat did not have the gentleman in her pocket.
"But how will we find him again?"
We followed him, and he went into the Morse building and got into the elevator, and we were going right in after him when who pops out but Dr. Caton, and he looked so surprised to see us that we hesitated, and the old elevator boy shut the door in our faces. But we asked a man who was standing there in a uniform, like a head janitor or something, if that gentleman in a black coat and hat and lavender tie had an office in the building, and he said yes, 7th floor, 796. He leered at us, but we looked real dignified, and Peg wrote it down on a piece of paper, and we walked away. So now all we've got to do is just go and see him.
And Pat hugged her slim knees in an ecstasy of satisfaction. The girls stared meditatively at a fat robin pecking into the grass in search of late dinner. To just go and see him was not as simple to the conspirators as it sounded, slipping from Pat's lips.
"Who'll go?"
Jip put the question that was in each mind.
Perhaps it would be too many if all 4 of us went. So let's draw lots which to—
Oh, no!
cried Jerry aghast. The others laughed.
It'd be fairest to leave Jerry out of the draw.
"I'll go,"
cried Jip grandly.
"if Pat or Peggy will go with me and do the talking."
What'll we say?
Now that the Ravens faced the fulfillment of their plans, they felt a little nervous.
"I know."
Jip's puzzled frown cleared magically.
"Mother has 5 tickets for the Philadelphia Symphony tomorrow night. I'll ask her to let us go, and invite Miss Grey to chaperone us. Then we'll write a note and tell this man that if he'll go to the concert and look at the third box on the left side, he'll see the lady of his heart, who has been faithful to him for years, in spite of her many other suitors. We'll put that in to make him appreciate what he's getting. It'll be much easier writing it than saying it."
"Jip, you're a wonder,"
cried the others, inspired to action.
"Let's go in and write the note now."
The Ravens, who met now at Pat Everett's house, had neglected Miss Gray of late. Carnations had succeeded the violets, then a single rose. Pat had even experimented with a nosegay of everlastings, which she had found in one of the department stores. It had been weeks since they had sent anything. For that reason, a little feeling of remorse added enthusiasm now to their plotting. Mrs. Wesley was delighted at Jip's desire to hear the concert and to include Miss Gray in the party. And Miss Gray's face had flushed with genuine pleasure when Jip invited her.
"Everything's all ready."
Jip tapped across to Pat Everett, and Pat, nodding mysteriously, pulled from her pocket the corner of a pale blue envelope. Directly after the close of school, Jip and Pat, with Jerry and Peggy Lee close at their heels to bolster their courage, walked briskly downtown to the Morse Building. If any doubts as to the propriety of their action crept into any one of the four minds, they were quickly dispelled, for the sake of sentiment. It, of course, would not be pleasant facing this stranger, but any momentary discomfort was as nothing, considering that their act might mean many years of happiness for poor, starved little Miss Gray. To avoid the leering elevator man, the two girls climbed the 6 flights to the 7th floor. Pat carried the letter. Jip agreed to go in first.
746, 748,
read Pat.
"It's the other corridor."
They retraced their steps to the other side of the building.
784, 788, 792.
Jip repeated the office numbers aloud.
796. Wilbur Stratman, undertaker! Pat Everett!
Jip clutched her chum's arm.
Undertaker! I won't go in for all the Miss Grays in the world.
Pat was seized with such a fit of giggling that she had difficulty in speaking, even in a whisper.
"Isn't that funny? We've got to go in. The girls are waiting. We'd never hear the last of it. He can't bury us alive. Oh, dear."
She wadded her handkerchief to her lips and leaned against the wall.
If Miss Gray wants an undertaker, she can have him. For my part, I should think she'd rather have a policeman, or the Iceman. Come on.
Jip's face was comical in its disgust. She turned the knob of the door. A thin, sad-faced woman told them that Mr. Stratman was in his office. She eyed them curiously as, with a jerk of her head, she motioned them through the little gate. As Jip with trembling fingers opened the door of the inner office, a man with a noticeable white streak in his hair pulled his feet down from his desk, dropped a cigar on his pen tray, and reached for a coat that lay across another chair.
Is this Mr. Stratman?"
asked Jip, wishing her tongue would not cling to the roof of her mouth. He nodded and waited. These young girls were not like his usual customers. Probably they had some sort of a subscription blank with them. He watched warily.
"Our errand is private,"
stumbled Jip, who could see that Pat was beyond the power of speech.
It's personal. We've come, in fact, of our own accord. She doesn't know a thing about it."
"She? Who?"
Miss Gray."
Jip glanced wildly around. Oh, she was making a dreadful mess of it. Why didn't Pat produce the letter instead of standing there like a wooden image? Being an undertaker, Mr. Wilbur Stratman met a great many women whom he never remembered.
Miss Gray, of course."
He nodded. Encouraged, Jip plunged on, with the one desire of getting the ordeal over with.
"She's dreadfully unhappy. She's been faithful to you all these years, and she's lived in the little boarding house and worked and wouldn't marry anyone else, and—"
With an instinct of self-defense, Mr. Stratman rose to his feet and edged ever so little toward the door. Plainly, these two very young women were stark mad.
I am very sorry for Miss Gray, but what can I do?
Oh, can't you marry her now? She's still very pretty.
Jip was trembling, but undaunted. The precipice was there. She had to make the leap. The undertaker paused in his contemplated flight to stare. Then he laughed, a loud, hoarse laugh that sent the hot blood tingling to Jip's face.
Who ever heard the beat of it? A proposal by proxy! My business is burying and not marrying. Pretty good. I don't know your Miss Gray. Even if I did, I can't get away with a husky wife and 6 children at home.
Pat pulled furiously at Jip's sleeve. A chill that felt like a cold stream of water ran down Jip's spine.
I don't get on to what you're after, Miss whatever your name is, but you're in the wrong pew. I never knew a Miss Gray, that I can remember, and I guess somebody's been kidding you.
Pat suddenly found her tongue, in the nick of time, too, for a paralysis of fright had finished poor Jip.
We must have made a mistake, Mr. Stratman. We are very sorry to have bothered you. We are in search of a certain party that has a white streak in his hair.
Oh-ho!
The undertaker clapped his hand to his head.
So that's the ticket, hey? Well, I've always said I couldn't get away from much with that thing always there to identify me, but I never calculated it'd expose me to any proposals.
He laughed again, doubling up in what Pat thought a disgustingly ungraceful way. She held her head high and pushed Jip toward the door.
We will say good-bye,
she concluded haughtily.
Say, kids, who are you, anyway?
His tone was quite unprofessional.
It is not necessary to divulge our identity.
And with Jip's arm firmly in her grasp, Pat beat a hasty retreat. Safe outside in the corridor, they fell into one another's arms, torn between tears and laughter. With mingled disgust and disappointment, the Ravens decided then and there to let love follow its own blind, mistaken course.
Miss Gray can die an old maid before I'll ever face another creature like that,
vowed Jip, and Pat echoed her words.
No one ever gets any thanks for meddling in other people's affairs, anyway,
Peggy Lee offered.
Nice time to tell us that,
was Jip's irritable retort. That evening Miss Gray, charming in a soft lavender georgette dress, which her clever fingers had made and remade, wondered why her 4 young charges were so glum. There was nothing in the world she loved so much as a symphony orchestra. She sat back in her chair, close to the edge of the box, with a happy sigh, and studied her program. Everything that she liked best: Chopin, Saint-Saëns, and Wagner, Siegfried's Death. Jip, eyeing her chaperone's happy anticipation, indulged in a whispered regret.
Doesn't she look pretty tonight? If that horrible creature only hadn't been...
The setting would have been so perfect for the denouement. She sprawled back resignedly in her chair, smothering a yawn. A flutter of applause marked the coming in of the orchestra. There was the usual scraping of chairs and whining of strings. Then suddenly Miss Gray leaned out over the box rail, exclaiming incoherently, her hands clasping and unclasping in a wild, helpless way. An opening crash of the cymbals covered her confusion. The 4 girls were staring at her, round-eyed. They had not believed Miss Gray capable of such agitation. Whatever had happened?
An old friend,
she whispered, her face alternately paling and flushing.
a very dear old friend, the third violin.
She leaned weakly against the box rail. The girls looked down at the orchestra. There, under the leader's arm, sat the third violinist, and a white streak ran from his forehead straight back through his coal-black hair. As though an electric shock flashed through them, the 4 girls straightened and stiffened. A glance, charged with meaning, passed from one to another. Jip, remembering the moment of confidence between her and Miss Gray, slipped her hand into Miss Gray's and squeezed it encouragingly. Not one of them heard a note of the wonderful music. Each was steadying herself for that moment when the program should end. The box was very near the little door that led behind the stage. Jip almost pushed Miss Gray toward it.
Of course you're going to see him. Hurry! You look so nice.
Jip was so excited that she did not know quite what she was saying.
Oh, hurry! You may never see him again.
Then they, precipitously and on tiptoe, followed little Miss Gray. Though it did not happen as each in her romantic soul had planned, it was none the less satisfying. In a chilly, bare anteroom off the stage, at a queer sound behind him resembling in a small way his name, the third violinist turned from the job of putting his violin into its box.
"Milly!"
he cried, his face flaming red with a pleased surprise.
"George!"
Miss Gray held back, twisting her fingers in a helpless flutter.
I thought when you sent the flowers and the verses that maybe you still cared."
Just for a moment a puzzled look clouded the man's face. Then a vision in the doorway of 4 wildly warning hands made him exclaim quickly,
"Care? Didn't I tell you, Milly, that I'd never care for anyone else?"
He took her right in his arms.
4 tongues explained at once. When the next day the self-appointed Committee on Romance reported back to the other ravens.
Of course he didn't know we were peeking. He isn't exactly the type I'd go crazy over, but he's so much better than that undertaker. And going home, Miss Gray told us all about it. It would make the grandest movie. She had to support her mother, and he didn't earn enough to take care of them both, and she wouldn't let him wait all that time. She told him to find someone else, but you see he didn't. Isn't love funny? And then when her mother finally died, she was too proud to send him word, and I guess she didn't know where he was anyway. Or maybe she thought he had gone, and done what she told him to do, and married someone else. And she believed all the time that he sent her those flowers. I suppose by that say it with flowers by telegraph from any part of the country method. Oh, I hope she'll wear a veil and let us be bridesmaids."
But little Miss Gray did not. Some weeks later, in a spick-and-span blue serge traveling suit, with a little bunch of pink roses fastened in her belt, she slipped away from her dreary boarding-house and met her third violinist in the shabby, unromantic front parlor of an out-of-the-way parsonage. The parson's stout wife was her bridesmaid. So much for gratitude. End of chapter 23. Chapter 25 of Highacres. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Highacres by Jane Abbott. Chapter 25. The Lincoln Award.
Who's going to win the Lincoln Award?
That question was on every tongue at Highacres. That interest rivaled even the excitement of Class Day and its honors, of the senior reception, Commencement itself. It shadowed the accustomed interval of alarm that always followed examinations. Everyone knew that the contest was close. No one could conjecture as to whom the honor would fall, for though one student be a wizard in trigonometry, he might have failed dismally in the simple requirement of setting up exercises or drinking milk.
"I've eaten spinach until I feel just like a cow out at pasture,"
declared Pat Everett disgustedly.
"And what good has it done? For I was only 85 in English."
"But think of all that iron in your system,"
comforted Peggy Lee.
"I hope Jerry wins the prize, but I'm afraid it is going to Jenny Cox. She was 99 in Cicero. I wish I had her brains."
"And her luck. Jenny herself says that it is luck half the time."
"Look how she got out of that scrape last winter,"
spoke up another girl. The ravens, who were in the group, suddenly looked at one another.
"It won't be fair if Ginny wins the award,"
was the thought they flashed. The records for the contest were posted the day before Class Day, the last day of examinations. A large group of boys and girls, eagerly awaiting them, pressed and elbowed about the bulletin board in the corridor, while Barbara Lee nailed them to the wall. Jip's inquisitive nose was fairly against the white sheet.
Virginia Cox!
She read shrilly.
Gerald Travis is only 2 points behind, and Dana King third.
An uncontrollable lump rose in Jerry's throat. She had hoped, she had dared think that she was going to win. She was glad of the babble under which she could cover her moment's confusion. She struggled bravely to keep the disappointment from her face as she turned with the others to congratulate Jenny. The plaudits of the boys and girls were warm and wholehearted. If any surprise was felt that it had been Jenny Cox and not Jerry Travis who had won the award, it was carefully concealed.
We might have known no one could beat you, Coxie.
It was that 99 in those Cicero.
Hurrah for Ginny!
Dana King trooped up a yell.
Lincoln Cox! Lincoln Cox!
Through it all, Jenny Cox stood very still, a flush on her face, but a distressed look in her eyes. The Jenny Cox whom her schoolmates had known for years would have accepted the hearty congratulations with a laughing, careless, "Why are you surprised?" manner. The Jenny Cox whom Jerry had glimpsed that winter afternoon preceding the basketball game was honestly embarrassed by the turn of events. She had not dreamed she could win. It had been that 99 in Cicero.
Jenny Cox, you don't look a bit glad,
accused one clear-sighted schoolmate. Alas, Jenny was not brave enough to clean her troubled soul with confession then and there. She tried to silence the small voice of her conscience. She made a desperate effort to be her own old self, evoking the homage of her schoolmates as she had done time and time again. She answered uneasily, with a smile that took in Jerry and Dana King.
I hate to be anyone like Jerry and Dana. It's so close.
Whereupon the excited young people yelled again for Travis and again for King. The crowd gradually dispersed. Little groups, arm in arm, excitedly talking, passed out through the big door into the spring sunshine. A buoyance in the very air proclaimed that school days were over. In one of these groups were Jenny Cox, Jip, Jerry, Pat Everett, Peggy Lee, and Isobel. Among them had fallen a constraint. Isobel broke it.
Jenny Cox, you haven't any more right to that award than I have. You know you built the snowman and Jerry took the blame, so's you could play basketball. She's the winner.
Each turned, surprised at Isobel's defense of Jerry's right, marveling at the earnestness in her face.
Oh, don't,
implored Jerry.
I'm glad Jenny won it.
Jenny stamped her foot.
I'm not. I wish I hadn't. I never dreamed I would, honest. What a mess. I wish I'd just turned and told them all about it, but I didn't have the nerve. I'm just yellow.
That, from Jenny Cox, the invincible forward. Breathless, the girls paused where they were on the grassy slope near the entrance of Highacres. A great elm spread over them, and through its shimmering green a sunbeam shot across Jenny Cox's face, adding to the fire of its sternness.
Girls,
she spread out her hands commandingly.
I don't know what you think, but I think Jerry Travis is the best ever at Lincoln. She's made me show up like a bad old copper penny longside of her. A year ago I could have taken this old award without a flicker of my littlest eyelash, but just knowing her makes it impossible. Now, what shall we do?
Jerry's remonstrance, a little quivery because she was deeply moved by Jenny's unexpected tribute, was drowned out in a general assent and a clamorous approval of Jenny's words.
I know,
declared Isobel, feeling that, because she was a senior, she must straighten out this tangle.
Let's tell Uncle Johnny all about it.
Uncle Johnny, to whom had been carried every hurt, every problem since baby days. The others agreed.
He's a trustee anyway,
Jip explained, though just how much of a trustee had to do with these complicated questions of school honor, none of them knew. And as though Uncle Johnny always sprang up from the earth at the very instant his girls needed him, he came up the winding drive in his red roadster. They hailed him. He brought the car to a quick stop.
Uncle Johnny, we want you to decide something for us. Please get out and come over here.
He stared at the serious faces. What tragedy had shadowed the customary gladness of the last day of school? He let them lead him to the old elm.
If you'll please sit down and pretend you're not our uncle, but sort of a judge, and listen, we'll tell you.
Dear me,
Uncle Johnny murmured weakly, sitting down on the slope.
This is bad for rheumatism and grey trousers, but I'll listen.
Isobel began the story with the building of the snowman. Jip took it up. Dramatically, with an eloquence reminiscent of that meeting of the ravens when the ill-fated lot had fallen to Jerry, she explained how, for the honor of the school, Jerry had shouldered Jenny's punishment. Peggy Lee interrupted to say that she thought Miss Gray had made an awful fuss about nothing, but Jenny hushed her quickly. Then the story came to the winning of the award.
2 points. Jerry only needed 2 points, and she lost 10 as a punishment about the snowman. Don't you see? She's really the winner.
Uncle Johnny had listened to the story with careful gravity. Inwardly, he was tortured with a desire to laugh. But he could not affront these girls so seriously bent on keeping unsullied that pure white thing they called honor.
Oh, youth, youth!
He thought, loving them the more for their precious earnestness.
And it's such a mix-up. We don't know what to do. If I knew who had given the prize, I'd go straight to him,
exclaimed Jenny bravely. Uncle Johnny straightened his immaculate gray-trousered legs and laid his straw hat down on the grass.
If that'll help things any, I'm he
explained with a little embarrassment.
You?
Really, Uncle Johnny?
Came in an excited chorus.
Yes, me.
With a fine scorn for grammar.
I'm the one who's to blame for all the carrots.
Pinching Jip's cheek.
But you have sort of mixed things up.
But we had to win that basketball game,
cried Jip.
And we couldn't unless Ginny played.
Yes, you had to win the basketball game.
He nodded with a judicious appreciation.
You see, Lincoln got the cup for the series.
And Jerry paid the price, yes.
For the honor of the school.
Then I'm afraid this is the last payment. You see, girlies, everything we do, no matter what it is fraught with consequences. If I were to go over to yonder lake and throw in a pebble, what would we see? Little ripples, circling wider and wider, further and further. That's like life. Our everyday actions are so many pebbles. We have to accept the ripples. It's sometimes hard, but I guess Jerry sees the truth.
There was no doubt from the expression of Jerry's face but that she saw the truth. Uncle Johnny's homely simile had made it very clear.
But I won't take it. That wouldn't be fair.
It was the new Jenny who spoke.
So it'll go to Dana King.
Yes, it will go to Dana King.
Uncle Johnny was serious now.
Jenny should not have accepted Jerry's sacrifice. Girls, there's a simple little thing called right that we find in our hearts if we search, that's finer than even the precious honor of your school. And Jip, you speak very truly when you say that is something you must valiantly always uphold. Now, if you'll let me tell this story of yours to the committee, I think it can all be straightened out, and we'll feel better all around.
And I'm glad it's Donna King,
exclaimed Peggy Lee.
Garrett said he had to give up his plans to go to college next fall, and he was terribly disappointed, and now maybe he won't have to.
Jerry and Jenny linked arms as they walked away with the others behind Uncle Johnny. The shadows dispelled. In youth, the sun is always so happily close behind all the little clouds. The girls' spirits went forth joyously to meet the interests of the moment: the class oration, the class gift, the class song, Isobel's graduating dress, the senior bouquets, the 101 exciting things about the proud class of girls and boys who were, in a few days, to pass forever from the school life. Graduates. Uncle Johnny watched his girls join others and troop away, with a light step, heads high. He chuckled, though behind it was a little sigh.
Doc, my boy, you were right. It has made me 10 years younger to mix up with these youngsters.
As he turned to go into the building, he met Barbara Lee coming out. He suddenly remembered that the business of the award had to do with Barbara Lee. Somehow, he almost always had, nowadays, to consult her about something. Very sweetly she went back with him to her office. He told her what the girls had told him. She listened with triumph in her face.
I knew Jerry Travis did not do that, but oh, aren't they funny?
However, her tone said that these funny girls were very dear to her.
It'll take something very real out of my life when I leave Lincoln.
What do you mean?
John Wesley's voice rang abruptly.
Of course, you haven't heard. I've had a wonderful offer from a big export house in San Francisco. It's the same firm to which I expected to go last summer, before I came here. You see, the road I chose to climb to the stars wasn't entirely long. Physical training. My last year in college, I specialized in export work. There was a fascination in it to me. It's such a growing thing, a challenging work, and it carries one into new and untried fields. There's an element of adventure in it.
Her eyes glistened.
I shall spend a year at the main office, then they're going to send me to China because I can speak the Chinese language.
John Wesley stared at her. She seemed like such a slip of a girl.
And Mother is so much better now that there is no reason why I cannot go.
Though they had yet to straighten out the matter of the award, she quite involuntarily held out her hand as she spoke, and John Wesley took it in both of his.
I hope this is the road to the stars.
That did not sound properly congratulatory, so he added lamely,
I'm glad, if you want to go, but what will we do without you here?
End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Highacres. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Highacres by Jane Abbott. Chapter 26. Commencement.
Commencement,
declared Jip, wise with her 15 years,
are like weddings, all sort of weepy.
What do you know of weddings, little one?
From Graham.
I guess I've been to 5, Graham Wesley, and someone is always crying at them. Why, when Cousin Alicia Stowe was married, she cried herself.
Did you cry, Mother?
asked Tibby curiously. Mrs. Wesley laughed.
I did, really, and I cried at my commencement. There were only 12 of us graduated that spring from Miss Oliver's academy, and none of us went to college, so you see it really was the end of our school days. I was very happy until it was all over. Then I remember, as I walked down the aisle in my organdy dress, we wore organdy then too, girls, with a big bouquet of pink roses on my arm, and everyone smiling and nodding at all of us, it came over me with a rush that my school days were all over and that they'd never come back. So I cried. For a very weepy half-hour I wanted more than anything else to be a little girl again, with all childhood before me. I was afraid to look ahead into life.
But there was Father. You knew him then, didn't you?
A pretty color suffused Mrs. Wesley's cheeks.
Yes, there was Father. I said I only cried for half an hour. 2 years afterward I was married, and I cried again. Of course I was very, very happy, but I knew I was going away forever from my girlhood.
Mother,
protested Isobel.
You make me feel dreadfully sad. I wanted to cry yesterday when Sheila Quinn spoke at the Class Day exercises. Wasn't she wonderful when she said how Lincoln School had given us our shield and our armor, and that we always must live to be worthy of her trust? I thrilled to my toes. But if it makes one cry to be married.
Darling.
And Mrs. Wesley took Isobel's hand in hers.
We leave our childhood and again our girlhood with a few tears, perhaps, but always there is the wonder of the bigger life ahead. I think even in dying there must be the same joy, and although we do shed tears over the youth we tenderly lay aside, they are happy tears, tears that sweeten and strengthen the spirit too.
Well, I'm glad I have 2 more years at Highacres,
cried Jip, looking with pity at Isobel's thoughtful face.
And I'm glad,
Isobel added slowly,
that if I decided to go to college, it must be dreadful to know that school is all over. I wouldn't be Amy Mathers for anything. It sounds so silly to hear her talk of all she's going to do next winter. Such empty things.
Isobel, in her scorn, had forgotten that only a few weeks back she had wanted to do just what Amy Mathers was planning to do.
Well,
Graham stretched his arms.
School's all right, but I'm mighty glad vacation has come.
Through their talk, Jerry had sat very still. To her, the Class Day exercises of the school had opened a great well of sentiment. All through her life, she thought, she would strive to repay by worthiness the great debt of inspiration she owed to the school. She had not thought of it in just that grand way until she had heard Sheila Quinn, until Dana King had given the class prophecy, until Jenny had read the school poem, until Peggy Lee had presented the class gift to the school. A young alumna of the preceding class had welcomed the proud graduates. Dr. Caton had presented the Lincoln Award to Dana King. A murmur had swept the room when he announced that, through a mistake in the records, the award went to Dana King instead of either Miss Cox or Miss Travis. Jerry sat next to Jenny, and, as Dr. Caton spoke, she squeezed Jenny's hand in a way that said plainly, "If I had to do it all over again, I'd do the same thing." Afterward, Dana King had shaken her hand warmly, and had declared that he
couldn't understand such good fortune, and it meant a lot to him, for it made college possible.
It seemed to Jerry as though they were all standing on a great shining hill from which paths diverged. Attractive paths that beckoned, that precious word college. Isobel, Dana King, Peggy Lee were going along that path. Sheila Quinn was going to study to be a nurse. Amy Mathers had chosen a more flowery way. Would her happiness be more lasting than the pretty flowers that lured her? Jerry's own path was a steep, narrow, little path, and led straight away from Highacres, but it led to SunnySide. So, with a little ache that gripped her when she thought that she must very soon leave Highacres forever, was a great joy that in a few days now she would see her precious sweetheart, and Jip and Isobel would be with her. The whole family was in a flutter over the commencement. Graham's class was to usher. The undergraduates were to march in by classes. The girls in white carrying sweet peas. The boys wearing white posies in the lapels of their coats. Mrs. Wesley inspected her young people with shining eyes.
You look like the most beautiful flowers that ever grew,
she cried in a choky way that mothers have at such moments.
I wish I could hug you all, but it would muss you dreadfully.
Thank goodness, Mammy, that you don't find any dirt on me,
exclaimed Graham, whose ruddy face shone from an extra party scrubbing.
Am I all right, Mother?
Begged Isobel, pirouetting in her fluffy white. Uncle Johnny rushed in. He was very dapper in a new tailcoat and a flower in his buttonhole. He was very nervous, too, for he was to give the address of the day. He pulled a small box from his pocket.
A little graduating gift for my Bunny.
It was a circlet pin of sapphires. He fastened it against the soft white folds of her dress.
You know what a ring is symbolic of, Isobel. Things eternal, everlasting, never-ending. That's like my faith in you.
He lifted the pretty, flushed, happy face and kissed it.
Come on now. Everybody ready?
If they had not all been so excited over the commencement, they must have noticed that there was something very different in Uncle Johnny's manner, a certain breathless exaltation, such as one feels when one has girded oneself for a great deed. He had made up his mind to something. The day before, while he had been preparing the commencement address, all kinds of thoughts haunted him, thoughts concerning Barbara Lee. That half hour with her in her little office, when she had told him she was going away, had opened his eyes. He had cried out, "What will we do without you?" He had really meant, "What will I do without you?" Absurd, he tried to reason the whole thing calmly. Absurd that this slip of a girl who knew Chinese had become necessary to his happiness. How in thunder had it happened? But there is no answer to that, and he was in no state of mind to reason. She was going away, and he could not let her go away. So all the while he was dashing off splendid things about loyalty. John Wesley had won several oratorical contests at college. His brain was asking humbly,
"Will she laugh at an old bachelor like me if I tell her?"
He had hated the face he saw in the mirror, edged above his ears with closely clipped gray hair. 36 years old. He had not thought that so very old until now. Contrasted with Barbara Lee's splendid youth, it seemed like 90.
"I'll tell her, just the same,"
was his final determination. She was on her way to the stars, but he wanted her to know that he loved her with a strength and constancy the greater for his 36 years. From the platform he stared out over the sea of serious young faces, and saw only the one. He stood before them all, speaking with an earnestness and a beauty of thought that was inspired, not by the detached group of graduates listening with shining eyes, but by Barbara Lee, sitting with a rapt expression that seemed to separate herself and him from the others and bring them very close. Loyalty was his theme, loyalty to God, loyalty to one's highest ideals, loyalty to one's country, to one's fellow men. After he had finished, there was the stir which always marks, in a gathering of people, a high pitch of feeling. Then someone sang clear soprano notes that drifted through the room and mingled with the spring gladness. The air was fragrant with the sweetness of the blossoms which decked the big room. Through the long windows came the freshness of the June world outside. It was a day, an hour, sacred to the rights of youth. More than one man and woman, worn a little with living, sat there with reverence in their hearts for these young people, who, strong with the promise of their day, stood at the start. Then the school sang their alma mater, the undergraduates singing the first two verses, the graduates singing the last. The dear familiar notes rang with a truer, braver cadence. One voice, clearer than the others, broke suddenly with feeling.
"Wasn't it all perfectly beautiful?"
cried Jip, as the audience moved slowly after the file of graduates.
"You couldn't tell which was best of the program, and it was sad, wasn't it? Wasn't Uncle Johnny splendid? And didn't the girls look fine? You know Sheila Quinn was just sick over her dress. It was so plain, and she looked as lovely as any of the others. Oh, goodness, think how you'd feel if we were graduating. But I hope our commencement will be just as nice. There's Barbara Lee. Let's hug her. Think how dreadful to have her go away. And Dana King's just waiting for you, Jerry."
Jip ended her outburst by rushing to Miss Lee and throwing her long arms about her shoulders. John Wesley advanced upon them, with the strange new look still in his eyes.
"Jip, you're wrinkling Miss Lee's pinkness."
He tried to make his tone light.
"Will you come to the library for a moment, Miss Lee? There's a book I want you to find for me."
His eyes pleading. Wondering a little, Barbara Lee walked away with him.
"Well, I never!"
declared Jip, disgusted. Then, in the stress of saying good-bye to some of her schoolmates, she forgot Uncle Johnny and Barbara Lee. John Wesley had felt that the library would be quite deserted. Standing in the embrasure of the window through which the June light streamed, he told Barbara Lee in awkward, earnest words all that was in his heart. There was a humility in his voice, as he offered her his love, that brought a tender smile to the corners of her lips.
"I wanted you to know,"
he finished simply.
"I don't suppose what I can offer can find any place in your heart alongside of your splendid dreams, but I wanted you to know that you have—"
"There's more than one way to the stars,"
she interrupted, lifting glowing eyes to his. Jip had said good-bye to everyone she could lay a finger on. Then she remembered Uncle Johnny.
"Do you suppose they're in the library yet?"
She and Jerry tiptoed along the corridor and peeped in the door. To their embarrassed amazement, Uncle Johnny and Barbara Lee were standing looking out the window, with their hands clasped. Jip coughed, a cough that was really a funny sputter.
Did you find your book, Uncle Johnny?"
Uncle Johnny turned, without a blush.
"Hello, Jip."
As though he'd never seen her before.
"I didn't find the book, because I wasn't really after a book. But I did find what I wanted. What would you say, Jip and Jerry, if I told you that your Barbara Lee is not going away?"
End of chapter 26. Chapter 28 of Highacres. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Highacres by Jane Abbott. Chapter 28. Her Mother's Story. Some time after she had gone to sleep, Jerry wakened suddenly with the disturbing conviction that someone needed her. At the same moment, her ear caught a sound that made her slip her bare feet quickly to the floor and stand listening. It had been a soft step beneath her window, a little sigh. In a flash, Jerry sped down the narrow stairway, past the open door of the room where Little Dad lay snoring, and out across the veranda. In the dim light of the moon that hung low in the arc of the blue-black sky, Jerry made out the figure of her mother, standing near the rough bench that overlooked the valley.
"Mother?"
"Jerry, child, and in your bare feet!"
"I heard you out here. Isn't it dreadfully late? Can't you sleep? Mother, look at me."
For Mrs. Wesley had kept her face averted.
"Mother, darling, why do you look so sort of sad?" "We're so happy now that we are together, aren't we? And it will be nice to have lots of things, and Little Dad won't ever have to worry, and—"
Mrs. Travis lifted her hand suddenly and laid it across Jerry's lips.
"Child, I am not sad. I have been out here fighting away forever the foolish fears that have stalked by my side since you were a very little girl. Some day, when you're a mother, you'll know how I've felt, how I've dreaded facing this moment, how often I've sat with you and watched the baby robins make their first flight from the nest, and had laughed at the fussy mother robin scolding and worrying up in a near-by branch."
"But, Mamsie, you've always told me how the mother robin pushes the little ones out of the nest to make them know that they can fly."
Mrs. Travis accepted the rebuke in silence. Jerry slipped her hand into her mother's. Her mother held it close.
"Jerry, dear, I've never told you much about myself, because I could not do that without telling you of your own father. I was a very lonely little girl. I had no brothers or sisters, no near relatives. My mother died when I was 8 years old, and a housekeeper, good soul, brought me up. My father was a professor of chemistry in Harvard, as you know, and he was a queer man, and his friends were peculiar too. Not the sort that was much company for a young girl. But I was very fond of my father, and I was very content with my simple life, until I met Craig Winton. He was so different from any one else who had ever crossed our threshold that I fell in love with him at once. My father died suddenly, and Craig Winton asked me to marry him. It was the maddest folly. He had nothing except his inventive genius, and he should never have tied himself to domestic responsibilities. They were always, such as they were, like a dreadful yoke to his spirit. But we were happy, oh, we were happy in a wonderful, unreal way. Sometimes we didn't have enough to eat, but he always had so much faith in what he was going to do, that somehow kept us going. But when his faith began to die, it was dreadful. It was as though some hidden poison was killing him right before my eyes.
What made his faith die?
Asked Jerry, curiously.
Because he grew to distrust his fellow men. That second visit to Peter Westley.
Mrs. Travis spoke quickly to hide her bitterness.
He was so sure that what he had made was good. An inventor has always, my dear, an irrational love for the thing he has created, and to have it spurned! He was super-sensitive, super-everything. Then my own health went to pieces. I suppose I simply was not getting enough to eat to give me the strength to meet the mental strain under which I had to live. And you were coming. From his last visit to Peter Westley he returned with a little money, but he was as a crushed, broken man. His bitterness had unbalanced his mind. He said that it was for my health that he came away with me, but I knew that it was to get away from the world that he hated, and to hide his failure. Your little dad took us in. He knew at once that your father was a very sick man, and he brought him to his cabin here on Kettle. But even here your father suffered, and after you were born he feared for you. He was obsessed with the thought that you had all life to face.
How dreadfully sorry you must have felt for him,
whispered Jerry shyly, trying to make it all seem true.
I felt sorry for him, child, not that he had been so disappointed, but because he had not the strength to rally from it. I don't believe God made him that way. I think he sacrificed too much of himself to his genius. This world we live in demands so much of us, such different things, that if we are to meet everything squarely, we cannot develop one side of our minds and let the other side go. I am telling you all this, Jerry, that you may understand how I have felt about you. The months after your father died were sort of a blank to me. I lived on here because I had nowhere else to go. Gradually my gratitude to John Travis turned to real affection. Not like what I had given to your father, but something quite as deep. And the years I have lived with him here have been very happy, as though my poor little ship had found the still waters of an island stream after having been tossed on a stormy sea. And I've tried to make myself think that in these still waters I could keep you always, and you would grow up here, and, perhaps, marry someone.
She laughed.
Mothers always dream way ahead, darling, but as you grew older I could see that that was not going to be easy. You've so quickly outgrown everything I can give you, or that anyone here can. You have grown so curious. Your mind is always reaching out. What is here? What is there? What is this? Where is that? Questions like these always on your tongue. And you are like your father, very.
Jerry shivered the least little bit, perhaps from the night air, warm as it was, perhaps from the thought that she was like poor Craig Winton, who did not seem at all like a real father. In a moment her mother had wrapped her in the soft shawl she carried. Something in the loving touch of her hands broke the spell of unreality that had held Jerry.
I don't understand, Mamsie,
she whispered, cuddling close.
If you felt like that and worried, why did you let me go away?
Because, my child,
There was something triumphant in her mother's voice.
some inner sense made me believe that though you look like your father, and act like him in many ways, you have a nature and a character quite of your own. I tried to put away the fears I had had, which I told myself were foolish and morbid. John Wesley's arguments helped me. I knew immediately that he was related to the Peter Westley who had crushed your father, but I felt certain he knew nothing of it, and I was glad. To bury the past entirely was the only way to bury forever the bitterness that had killed your father. And when John Wesley made the offer to give you a year of school, I thought it was only justice. I had known school life in a big city, where I had many schoolmates, and I lived for several years in the shadow of a great university, though the life in it only touched me indirectly, and when the opportunity opened, I wanted you to have the same experience. I felt it might solve the problem that confronted me, and I told myself that I was sure of you, that you could go away to school, go anywhere, and come back again and be my same girl. Jerry, these people have been very, very good to you. Out of pure generosity, they have given you a great deal. Do you now that you know the truth, feel any bitterness toward them?
Never had Jerry associated Uncle Johnny and Mrs. Wesley, nor the younger Westleys, nor the charming, hospitable home with the Peter Wesley she had pictured from Jip's vivid descriptions. And, too, remembering the pathetic loneliness of the old man's last days, she felt nothing but pity.
"Oh, no,"
she answered softly, decidedly.
"Anyway, he made up for everything he'd done when he gave beautiful Highacres to Lincoln School."
She added loyally. Then Jerry fell silent. "I was sure of you," her mother's words echoed. Had she not glimpsed more in those months at Highacres than her mother dreamed? A promise of what college might hold for her, new worlds to conquer?
"Mother, am I the same girl?"
She put the question slowly.
No, Jerry, and that's what I've been fighting out here, all by myself. For I realized that it was only selfishness made me dread finding a change, a mother's selfishness. That you should grow and go on and forward, even though you leave me behind, darling, I know must be my dearest wish. But, oh, my dear, I understand how the poor mother robin feels just before she shoves her babies out of the nest. For don't you think she hates an empty nest as much as any human mother? Do you remember the little story I used to tell you, when you were small enough to cuddle your whole self on my lap, how yours and my love was a beautiful sunny garden where you dwelt, and that garden had a very high wall around it?
"I love that story, Mamsie. I told it once to Mrs. Wesley, and she loved it too. And you used to say that there was a gate in the wall with a latch, but the latch was quite high, so that when I was little I could not find it."
And then you grew bigger, and your fingers could reach the latch. You wanted to open it, to go out and see what was outside. I had made the little garden as beautiful as I knew how, and it was very sunny, and the wall was so high that it shut out all trouble. But you wanted so much to open the gate that I knew I must let you.
"And then I went away to Highacres,"
put in Jerry, loving the story as much as ever.
"And I was alone in the garden our love had built, but I was not lonely. I will not be lonely, for, wherever you go, you are my girl, and I love you, and you love me. Nothing can change that. And I shall leave the gate open. It will always be open."
She said it slowly. Her story was finished. Jerry's face was transfigured.
You mean...
She spoke softly.
"that if I want to go back to Highacres, you'll let me? I can go to college? Oh, Mamsie, you're wonderful! Mothers are the grandest things. And the gate will always be open so as I can always come back? And you won't be lonely, for I'll always love you most in the world of anybody or anything. And when I'm very grown up, and can't go to school any more, we'll travel, won't we? You and me and little Dad, won't we, Mamsie?
Yes, dear.
But the mother's eyes smiled in the darkness. She was thinking of the empty nest. Jerry laid her cheek against her mother's arm. She drew a long breath.
The world's so wonderful, isn't it? It's dreadful to think of anyone in it, like my father, who set his heart so hard on just one thing that he can't see all the other things he might do. I shall never be like that. And it's dreadful.
She frowned sorrowfully out over the starlit valley.
To think of girls who haven't mothers and who can't go to school. Why, I'm the very, very richest girl in the world.
Then she blushed.
I don't mean that money, Mamsie. I meant having you, and SunnySide and Kettle, and just knowing about our garden.
End of chapter 28.